You're all very welcome to today's Client Experience Programme webinar on turning a crisis into an opportunity for cultural change. At this stage, we're settling into what is the second series of our Client Experience webinar programme. And I guess the lovely thing about that means that all the webinars have been designed and influenced by you and other general counsel around the world who've participated on the programme. And that means effectively that they're really focused on the issues that matter most to you. With that in mind, today's session is set at the intersection between compliance on the one hand and culture on the other. And it's really focused around how do you best position your organisation for success, whatever lies ahead, be that crisis or opportunity. I would say if your environment allows, do get involved, turn on your cameras. We'd love to hear some engagement and get you involved. Really do engage as we work through with any questions you might have around the practicalities of making this happen in your organisation. I'm delighted and excited to welcome two of my colleagues today as presenters. Max Carr-Howard, partner at Dentons and co-chair of our Global Compliance Investigations team. And also Elizabeth Scholes, partner at Dentons Global Advisors, which is our independent strategic advisory firm. Without further ado, I will hand you over to Elizabeth to get us started.
Thank you, Niamh, and thank you everyone for joining us. I'm Elizabeth Scholes. I specialize in reputation management, crisis communications, and crisis preparedness at Dentons Global Advisors. As Niamh said, we are a global business advisory firm, so we help clients who are preparing for, mitigating, managing challenging situations, times of transition, sometimes crises. We help them recover from those as well and seize opportunity coming out of that. We do that through a mix of what I do in crisis management, financial advisory services, government relations, public affairs, as well as managing geopolitical risk around the world and navigating different global markets. So glad to have you with us today, and I'll turn it over to Max.
Thanks, Elizabeth. It's a pleasure to be with you all. Thank you for joining. I do lead the co-lead the Global Compliance and Investigations team. Our team is in every part of the world. We're in more than 200 communities around the world, and we focus on providing effective compliance support and investigations by having local people participate in that work along with our global team. I'm a former federal prosecutor as well, and I've been working on compliance and investigative issues around the world for about 25 years.
Great.
Back to you, Elizabeth.
So just to give you a quick overview of today's agendas, we've covered off on our introductions. We're going to talk through a few topics today. First, the cost of non-compliance. We've pulled together a few statistics and trends, some of what we're seeing today in the marketplace, and some things that other folks are tracking and some things we've experienced ourselves in the work we're doing. We also want to talk about the broader impact of non-compliance. Of course, there is the financial impact, and we'll talk through quite a few examples of that. But there's so much more to the impact of non-compliance. So we want to make sure we emphasize the different ways that is manifesting. As I said, we've got a few examples of some recent compliance failures and the broad implications of those, a lot of which will look familiar to you most likely. Particularly from the media coverage some of them have generated. And then finally, we'll talk you through what constitutes a best practice compliance approach, looking at kind of where have we come from as far as what the standards for compliance have been, and what is really kind of required and best practice these days. And finally, we'll have some time for Q&A. So let's start with that cost of non-compliance, and we can, flat out say that it always exceeds the cost of compliance. And there's certainly, many statistics on this. Immediately found the top one here around specific to data protection regulations at 2.71 times higher. I know, Max and I have had conversations about his experience with this and what he's seen as far as, how much higher that cost can be. I don't know if you want to comment on that, Max.
Sure. I mean, most of the time people are talking about the cost of compliance in terms of fines. And that's absolutely important to take into account. As you can see, for example, banking fines have really gone up. The FCPA fine area is always going up, and fines are a leading indicator of costs. But there are so many other costs associated with non-compliance, from internal investigations to the cost of hiring lawyers for your employees who are subject to those investigations. Often you'll have to hire financial experts to forensically review that information. The audit committee sometimes needs one lawyer while the company needs another, and members of the board need a third. So the cost can be extraordinary. As I've said, I see it sometimes being 2 to 3 times the cost of the fine, sometimes as much as 4 times the cost of the fine. Sometimes that's misunderstood and not appreciated by folks until they're right in the middle of it.
Yeah, and I think when we kind of took a look at the snapshot of where we are right now, the themes were consistent. The pressure that's being added, the increased scrutiny, new and increased fines, whether it's the environment around ESG, GDPR fines going up, increased FCPA enforcement, and of course, a slew of investigations that have come out of the last 2.5 years of COVID. So, I think just important things to keep in mind when we think about, potentially a shift now of that scrutiny increasing and the financial and otherwise impacts increasing as well.
Absolutely.
So let's talk about some of those impacts beyond the financial. And I think a lot of these, as you can see, really have to do with the stakeholders in your universe. Whether it is, employees that you're turning over, maybe having trouble attracting talent and certainly retaining them, whether your customers may lose trust in the company, in the product, and go to other alternatives. Certainly, regulatory scrutiny, you may have the scrutiny of the agency that you're directly dealing with, but it's all just going to attract more attention from other regulators, and you'll see that in some of the examples we cite. Maybe you'll see loss of investor trust, and potentially a sell-off or sell-off over time. And then you may attract attention from other third parties, whether that's NGO activists or activist investors seeing you as a target. So this landscape is pretty broad, not to mention the potential for negative media coverage, which we've all watched in various cases. Can be quite significant, and of course reaches all of these different stakeholder groups to varying degrees and influences their opinion and their actions. You could certainly see additional financial implications in the stock price decline, whether short term or longer term. Management upheaval in many of the cases with resignations, sometimes in indictments and convictions, and so that can cause certainly a lot of short-term uncertainty and upheaval, but also have many long-term implications as well. So the point here is pretty simple. It's that the financial impact is very important, but the non-financial impact cannot be understated and should be just as much a part of the picture.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that is not often appreciated, particularly for longer term investigations, is that it really does disrupt the business. The attention of the board, the attention of chief executives and other people in the C-suite are taken away from the business mission. And even in the mid-level and lower levels of the company, attention is taken away. There's a lot of talk about what does it mean, and the business mission cannot proceed. And so a lot of the work that folks on this call are doing every day with compliance and with managing legal issues is really critical to the business succeeding long term, and is dramatically saving money by avoiding these kinds of ongoing costs. And in the age of Twitter and the rest of social media, it cannot be discounted, the NGO scrutiny. There are a lot of investigative reporters who have left the press and have gone into working directly for non-governmental organizations. And when they learn of these kinds of acts of non-compliance, either because of a government investigation or otherwise, they have been digging into it and publishing important papers that get picked up by their colleagues, former colleagues in the press. And that too can have a big impact on the culture and the community of the business, distracting from the primary motivation. And that those are aspects that can be useful to compliance and legal advisors in trying to explain why it is worth putting compliance first, as we'll talk in a little bit.
And we'll take a quick pause now to do a poll. There we go. Our first poll of the series: which impacts of non-compliance would concern you the most? And we've listed quite a few here, from financial impact, indictments and convictions we mentioned, executive turnover, financial impact like stock price, and employee customer exodus, NGO scrutiny, additional regulatory scrutiny, and negative press.
Great. So we'd love to understand how everyone on the call is thinking about this particular aspect. I can see lots of first movers who've already indicated which one speaks to them most. We will give everybody an opportunity, so we'll maybe leave 5 more seconds for you all to indicate your preference. So 5, 4, 3, you can see the numbers going up, 2, 1. Any last minute indicators? We'll give it 2 or 3 seconds more. Great. Okay.
Well, this is striking. I think that the conversations about financial impact certainly were appreciated. And I think it's really also striking that only a few were concerned about indictments and convictions. And I think that's an accurate view. Often you can resolve matters with the government without having indictment or convictions. And even if you do have those, much of the damage has already been done by the course of the investigation. It's the financial impact that is striking everybody, or so many people on this call. Elizabeth, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I think, this tracks with kind of what we've been hearing, but I do like to see some recognition of the other pieces of the, management turnover, because frankly, I think that has, a bigger impact than, say, the indictment of an individual executive. And so, I like to see that recognized along with the employees and customers as well. I think this is a tough one to choose, kind of the one you're worried about the most, because a lot of what we're talking about is being concerned about all of these, almost at the same time or over time. So appreciate everybody contributing. Great. So we will move on to some examples that we're citing here for you. We've got a couple here in the financial realm, and these may be familiar to you, particularly the first one, which got quite a bit of attention. It's a major U.S. financial institution, and the second one, an example of this happening very much in Europe as well. And so, Max, I wonder if you might want to talk through some of what we're seeing here, both from the financial side and those broader implications we're talking about.
Sure. I think particularly with the first one, this is an example of the unintended consequences of incentives. And at this particular bank, there was a whole lot of pressure put on lower level employees to sign people up, that is, to get more customers. And the reason for that was that the most senior executives at the company were going to get their compensation tied to that, to the number of accounts that were signed up. There was so much pressure put on lower level people that they felt, some of them felt the only way to meet the expectations were to sign people up who were not interested in particular products. So many customers were getting signed up who were not interested in products, and they only came to find out about it after they were penalized for not meeting the expectations of the product. That resulted in a lot of attention and an investigation. Very significant fines, $3 billion to the Department of Justice and the SEC. And that aggressive sales culture also resulted in very significant lawsuits, resulting in other significant fines. Yes, the CEO was forced out, and he personally had to pay a $17 million fine. Other top executives were forced out, and it's really changed the reputation of the bank for the long term, and really damaged them over time. And so it's an example where you really have to look at what are the incentives that you are putting on the company, on executives, and what are the incentives you're putting on the lower level people, and do those things encourage or manipulate people into doing things that they wouldn't otherwise do. This is why I think that looking at incentives is so important. We saw the same sort of behavior in a money laundering issue at a major European financial institution. It was not quite as significant, but it did illustrate a failure to invest in the compliance and the establishment of a compliance culture. It again came from the top, resulting in the CEO resignation and 3 board members being identified as subjects.
Okay, great. So we'll move on to a couple of environmental examples here. And, I think Max, you may touch on a little bit the different financial penalties here, because they're quite different, which is part of the impact. But, I think on these, we also really want to touch on, particularly the first one, that reputational damage that you're seeing long-term as a result of this.
So both of these are Clean Air Act violations, and we saw a lot of coverage. The first one, it was a purely civil penalty. The conduct was systemic, but it was intended to be delaying reporting. And the goal for that delay, rather than just an out-and-out lie, was tied to trying to avoid financial costs of defective products, to reduce the number of recalls that they might engage in. There was widespread manager and staff awareness of this approach, also undermining their overall compliance culture. And they ended up paying the largest civil penalty of $180 million for that violation. That result has caused damage to the quote unquote green reputation of this particular company, and has resulted in a broader push to strengthen environmental regulations related to this piece. The more dramatic case, of course, is the second one, where the penalty just for the crime committed here, which was determined to be intentional and lasted several decades, was $2.8 billion. Overall, it led to many investigations by many other jurisdictions, and those jurisdictions imposed their own penalties, both civil and criminal. There were also congressional investigations, state legislative investigations, EU and multicultural, multiple other countries led investigations, all of this taking attention away from the business and resulting in more than $15 billion in fines and the loss of senior leadership. Again, the whole focus of this was basically to mislead the technology designed to detect particular ratings on diesel machines. So they wanted to be out in front from a business perspective, on the diesel reputation, and they did that for a while. But the ultimate cost of that was so dramatically negative. It clearly wasn't in their interest, and has caused long-term damage to this company.
Yeah, these are really good examples of kind of short-term gains, that short-term perspective of, how can we push this off so that we don't have to deal with it now? And how can we reach these short-term goals that we're told are important? Both of them not having the sight of the long-term impact, which they're both going to experience for some time now.
Yeah.
And on our third piece, in the technology industry, I think we could talk a little bit about the dynamic with China here, which is really important, as well as the environment in the technology industry around transparency and privacy and data breaches. So I'll turn it over to you, Max, to kick that off.
Absolutely. Thanks, Elizabeth. And I think there's sort of two different stories on this slide. The first is that China really is engaging in some of policing of its own industry. This is a record fine for antitrust violations for a major e-commerce giant based in China. And that will create more cooperation and similar scrutiny from the US. But also interesting, in China, there is sort of a battle between the regulators, and China has been passing a bunch of rules that impose restrictions on the ability of companies to cooperate with US investigations. So you want to be very careful if you are operating in China about proceeding with investigations because of the rules that they're imposing there. You need to do them. You need to understand what went wrong. There's just a thoughtful way to do it so that you don't create more problems. Again, a reason to have some colleagues on the ground in the location where you're doing the work. With regards to the second example, the fines that we're talking about here relate to a very specific company, but we've seen GDPR fines being imposed across the board. They're getting much more aggressive as it's ramped up. And it's causing reputational damage to companies, and companies are having to take very significant approaches to privacy. The interest in privacy that the European regulators have created is also creating lots of issues in the United States. California has passed a bunch of rules, and you're seeing a bunch of back and forth pressure between different companies, different countries and their regulatory schemes. The Cloud Act was passed a few years ago in the United States, trying to obtain access from a law enforcement perspective of private data in Europe. And that hasn't been fully tested, but it does create a lot of pressures on companies. The individual countries in Europe, in addition to having European-wide fines, are also pursuing cases, the French and the Irish in particular. So this is led to growing pressures on privacy, and companies need to appreciate the very different philosophies of those schemes in the different parts of the world, and the need for American companies in particular to step up and recognize the implications for their business culture.
Great. So we're going to pause for a second poll around the areas of enforcement that create the greatest challenge in your view. GDPR and data privacy, antitrust, anti-bribery, human rights, environmental, supply chain controls, and ESG reporting.
Okay, great. So again, we'd love to understand how everyone on the call thinks about this particular one. So which areas of enforcement most stand out to you in the context of your experience within your own organization or other cultures you've worked in? It's great to see the numbers going up. Let's see if we can beat how many participants we had the last time. So we'll leave a few seconds more for everyone to indicate their views on this one. Counting down from 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, excellent. A few last minute voters here, so we'll allow a little bit for that. That's excellent.
Well, this is also an interesting result. I think GDPR and data privacy generally is still new enough in parts of the world that it's difficult for companies to fully grab a hold of the challenges that they face under those rules, and how do they successfully manage the restrictions and building a culture of understanding, frankly, about what those restrictions are. So I'm not surprised to see that. I do think that some of the new areas, the last 3 that some folks picked on, the human rights allegations, environmental, sometimes those 2 are put together as ESG, and the supply chain controls are really going to become significant as new legislation in the United States restricting the ability of companies to transfer or import products that were made by Uyghurs who are under forced labor conditions in China, which is going to really start to impact people, and understanding the supply chain as a whole, and trying to police your own supply chain is going to become a really big challenge for many companies. Elizabeth?
Yeah, agreed. Not surprised by the GDPR, but hearing so much right now around the different aspects of ESG, and certainly the supply chain challenges that companies are facing, but we all experience as consumers in our daily life as well. So I think there's quite a bit of concern to spread around with these choices. Great. So now we're going to go into the last piece of what constitutes a best practice compliance approach, and talk through, as I said, first, kind of what's the baseline, what have we started with the traditional approach to compliance, and how has that changed, and how have the requirements changed. So Max, I don't know if you want to talk through kind of what has been the traditional approach been to compliance.
So more than 30 years ago, the FCPA was passed in the United States, and it started to set the foundation. And you can see that also in the United States sentencing guidelines, both of which set out the expectations of the United States on what a good compliance program looks like, and how to evaluate whether or not a compliance program is effective. What's interesting about that history is that many of the terms, though they are described in slightly different ways in different parts of the world, are really adopted by other regulatory structures. But the traditional approach, as you'll see here, is really focused on the policing of the environment of the company from a compliance and legal department perspective. The critical elements of a compliance program from most regulators' perspective starts with a risk assessment. Where are the risks that we could get into hot water? Some of the topics that we've just described here with the GDPR, with anti-bribery, antitrust, and so on are definitely there. And then implementing policies and procedures that help enforce the approach so that those risks are not breached, making sure you have adequate training and communication about it, having a confidential or anonymous reporting system, and how you conduct your investigations. Is it adequately independent? And of course, mechanisms to deal with your third parties and due diligence of your companies that you may merge with or acquire. Those are the key critical elements of a compliance program. Then to evaluate it, what the regulators look at is what's the tone from the top. Does it illustrate that the expectations of the board and the C-suite and even middle management today are really making this point that compliance is important? Are there adequate resources given to compliance and legal? And are they adequately independent from the C-suite? Are there incentives that are problematic? Do you have appropriate disciplinary measures? and whether or not you are constantly improving, testing, reviewing that process. And that your investigations are done by qualified people, and that they look at the whole picture, not just little bits. So that's the standard sort of approach, which is fine. But as I said, you can tell it's really focused on the policing of the company. And policing is not necessarily the best way to bring about cultural change.
So let's take a look. Excuse me, let's go back one more. At, what does make an effective compliance program on top of kind of those building blocks, from more than 30 years ago? How is the perspective changed? Well, for one, it really needs to be an enterprise-wide effort. I can't emphasize this enough. And so, I think the secondary piece to that is really, how is the business working with compliance and vice versa? How are you making sure that the business understands the importance of compliance, understands the cost of non-compliance, sees that as important, as critical to the business strategy? How are you making sure that compliance understands the business's strategy, and knows, how do we get these two linked up, understand the importance of one another and how they need to work together? Another point that Max talks a lot about is the focus on profitability over revenue, which is a really critical piece of that. So Max, I don't know if you want to chime in on a few of this, and the overall importance of the fusing of the business interests is with compliance.
Absolutely. Sometimes we think of this as making this getting everybody to think of themselves as a compliance officer. But really what I'm trying to do with this idea of fusing the interests, and it really comes down to profitability versus revenue, is demonstrating that the work that the compliance officers and the lawyers on this call do every day actually makes the company more profitable. And that is because if you look at profitability rather than revenue, then you take into account the costs, of course, of your compliance programs, but also of non-compliance. The damage that can be done to your bottom line by having to pay huge fines and then pay lawyers 2 or 3 times more than those big fines clearly undermines profitability. Looking at profitability as from a multi-year process also is really important, because that allows you to sort of have a longer horizon, something that can be undermined by compensation schemes. And in particular, the decision to give people bonuses based on revenue, because you can't quite yet figure out the profitability, actually encourages people to engage in schemes that pump up revenue, even if in the long run you end up losing money. I see that there's two questions actually in the system. One is more of a comment. I do agree with the recommendation to watch Scandal on Netflix. It's fascinating. It does illustrate a great example of money laundering. And then the second question is, do we recommend compliance investigations be carried out by legal, compliance, HR, or employee relations? I think my answer to that question is it depends on what the issue is. If it is a run-of-the-mill labor question, there's nothing wrong with having HR do the investigation, at least as an initial matter. But I think that overall, you want to have a lawyer leading any significant investigation to maximize the applicability of the attorney-client privilege. And when issues become significant, careful consideration of hiring outside counsel should be taken into account. The advantage of outside counsel in particular is to be able to establish to the regulators that from the get-go, you had an independent examination of what was going on, that there was no whitewashing going on. So my recommendation for significant matters is to have them be led by the legal department in coordination with compliance. Now, if you have the two departments in one, you never have too big of an issue. If you have two separate departments, I will say that the compliance department often does not have a large number of lawyers in it, so you can undermine the privilege piece, and so that's something to think about. And my recommendation is that you have a hierarchy, a sort of a system to determine how big of an issue you think this is, how significant the risks are, and then to go back and reevaluate as time goes on because you discover new things. Going back to this slide just for a moment, if you make compliance as part of your strategy as you focus on profitability, what that does is it fuses the process together. And you get the business personnel to see the advantage of having a strong compliance approach, and you help the compliance team really understand the business goals, so that they can actually advance those business goals, help facilitate achieving what the business team wants to do, but in a manner that doesn't run great risk. It also leaves behind the silos and isolations that happen too often, even between regular business departments, but absolutely between business, legal, and compliance. Compliance really needs to be at the forefront of each new endeavor, and not an afterthought. Too often, business teams can work out who they want to sign a contract with, identify exactly the best player from a business perspective, and then at the very end bring in somebody who can sign off on or bless the transaction. If they do it together, then you can have an understanding of balancing the risks and the rewards right from the get-go, and compliance can point the business team in the right direction right from the get-go, and that allows you to very quickly sign off on the contracts and move the project forward. And then the last bit that I think I want to highlight here, and then I'll turn it back to you, Elizabeth, is getting away from the so-called desktop risk assessment. The desktop risk assessment just really looks at sort of everyday understood risks. What you really need to understand is what is the business mission and how does the business mission and the business approach impact risk? And to do that, to have that deep conversation, you need to sit around the same table. The compliance team working with the business team to achieve the business goals, to make the business more profitable and to minimize risk. And you really need to have many conversations and be part of one team to make that function.
Right. So let's talk a little bit more specifically what goes into this more effective compliance program, and a little bit more about creating real cultural change. Max spoke about kind of the traditional approach of the tone from the top. It's so much more than that now. Really, is in seeing that behavior modeled at the top, modeled, by your manager, your peers, you modeling that behavior for others. Much more than kind of what you're saying, but also seeing that in practice. Making sure that the mandates are very clear and that there is consistent, regular messaging over the long term in all the different areas where you're going to hear compliance-related messaging. And I would say that the consistency and the kind of the long-term commitment to making sure these messages are getting through are really important. Inclusion is also really important. There may be folks, some of you included, that have compliance, that is central to the role that you play. There are a lot of people that have activities in their day-to-day work that touch on compliance that are related or tangential. They need to understand, how important this culture is. What are their responsibilities related to this? So really kind of fostering this culture with that type of inclusion is critical. Of course, resource allocation, and we really mean that from, you know, a variety of perspectives, making sure that you have the right people to implement the systems, help implement the culture and maintain that, making sure that, you know, that frankly, the time is allocated for them to be able to do that. Sometimes that could be, you know, hiring, sometimes that's within the existing infrastructure. Internal, external, you know, these resources can come from a variety of sources. And of course, the budget devoted to this to make sure that it's a priority and has a chance of success. Third-party experts helping, you know, Max has talked about the important role of outside counsel, and certainly communications experts in this area, helping to implement this regular communication that we're talking about, many having expertise in training as well. And, you know, I think that actually also feeds into the next bullet here of making sure that the different processes that are going on in your organization are linked up. You know, we're frequently involved in crisis planning, which we certainly try to encourage linking up with, you know, what is going on with the ESG planning, what type of enterprise risk management process are you going through? And this would have, you know, absolutely include implementing a culture around compliance. So, you know, this goes back to this incredibly important point that we've been talking about of the linkage of the business with compliance. And, you know, these are just a few examples of all the different things that are going on within the business. And if we can get everybody all around the table, it's going to be that much more efficient and effective. And finally, technology. Times have changed a lot since we were talking about kind of those fundamentals of compliance. And so how can we use technology in a variety of ways to, again, make this so much more efficient? And I think that goes a lot to the connectivity of the different groups we're talking about.
Yeah, I think that, you know, one of the things I've been thinking about as we've been working on this project is that, you know, those companies that we gave as examples with the financial institutions or with the violations of environmental laws, they had cultures. The cultures they had were ones that put profitability, or at least revenue, over and above the importance of compliance. It was very clear to everybody in the organization that they were going to cheat the system and make the system give inaccurate information to regulators. And there are many other examples of this. The granddaddy of them all, Siemens, was originally changed its culture dramatically. But originally had a culture where, you know, anything went, that they were just going to make money. So those cultures were developed over time, and they were developed through messaging and through clear, regular, engaged conversation. And you can create an alternative culture by having clear mandates, regular messaging, engaging with everybody in the organization. And I think importantly, really thinking about where your incentives are. How do you really change the culture? It's by rewarding compliant behavior and punishing non-compliant behavior.
So we've got a third poll for you here. Third and final, what do you see as the biggest obstacle to establishing a compliance culture within your organization? So we'll give you a few minutes to look at these options.
Great. So as Elizabeth said, our last one for today, we have also included an other option on it. If you're choosing other, just pop us a note in the chat if there's something else that's top of mind in terms of thinking about, you know, the obstacles and the barriers to really, I suppose, embedding a different type of culture in your organization. So lots of you have already indicated we're really getting lots of engagement on this one. So we'll just do a 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And let's share the results with everybody. And thanks, Becky. I know you put in your other as well in the chat, so thank you for that, and great to see you today.
I'm very interested in this, building the partnership and building understanding and building business understanding in the compliance department is absolutely spot on. I'm asking a lot with this kind of approach, and you will be asking a lot. It really requires long-term engagement. It really requires many conversations. And frankly, I think one of the best ways to get that kind of engagement is to say to business, look, we recognize that some of our procedures and policies get in the way. So let's talk about how we can do this together and make things more efficient and more effective and help you make more profit. Because when you come to them with that message, as opposed to don't do this, don't do that, then you open their ears. It's really behavioral modeling, as Elizabeth was saying earlier, but you engage with them on their terms, talking about what they think is important, and then demonstrating how this is so important to make these changes. I think that you really can begin that conversation, but it takes time. And it takes, not just one little training session once a year, but regular long-term engagement and lots of support from your C-suite. Elizabeth, what are your thoughts?
Well, I definitely expect to see a smattering of the top three. But I do have to say I'm pleased to see the recognition of internal communications in there as well, because I think that's potentially overlooked when you're thinking about making this cultural change where the business and compliance are really linked together. But internal communication is obviously a critical tool for doing that. So pleased to see that recognition as well.
While we're switching to the next slide, I just want to note that Becky recognized an obstacle, that there are often country variations between or variations between countries in a global company, and that's absolutely true. And one of the things that's important is to have a clear set of global values and global approaches, so that you can take those country by country variations and feed them back up into the global approach. You can do that with incentives, and you can, from a purely economic perspective, and you can do that with compliance. You do need to have people engaged on a local level. I think that much better system is to have your compliance and legal teams engaged right with the business team, right where the business is happening, and not all clustered in one building in one location in the world. There is some centralization that is critical as well. But having people working side by side can make an enormous difference in changing culture.
So I think the last piece we want to touch on here is just, a bit of a summary of some of the things we've been talking about, some of the infrastructure that needs to be in place that we've talked about with incentives and discipline, the training, and then the messages you're communicating around that. Not doing the check the box once a year type of training. Another long-term piece is really making sure that you're reassessing where you are. What does the environment look like? What has changed? What do we need to remediate? So making sure that this is an ongoing, active maintenance of kind of the infrastructure in place. But here on the left, we've touched on a lot of kind of the softer challenges, I would say. We all know changing one person's view of something, their perspective, is significant and takes time. Changing the view and culture of a team, of course, is that much more challenging. And so, we really understand and recognize kind of the fundamental change that's required here. The two-way communication is really critical. So, want to emphasize engagement and discussion and listening beyond the messaging we're talking about, because it has to be kind of that two-way street for it to be as effective as it can be. And this is a long-term process. So making sure that that's understood, and that, again, kind of the resources are committed to make sure that, it's going to have success over time.
Yeah, I agree completely. It's going to be regular conversations and thinking about ways that you can engage in those conversations in settings that are not your regular training sessions. One of the things I've seen happen is putting together a slide that you have on every single PowerPoint that you have in your company as a standard approach, requiring some conversation about the compliance message. It's helpful to have the CEO or the CFO on the slide making a comment about its importance. It's also enormously powerful in demonstrating the company's commitment to it going forward. But we'd like to invite some opportunity for people to ask questions. We've only got 8 minutes left, so we wanted to give you all the opportunity to ask some questions about topics that are on your mind. You can ask some, as we've already had, in the chat, and otherwise you can speak right out. Elizabeth, what has been on your mind in this area?
Well, I think that, one thing that we're working with companies a lot on is fusing, again, to use that word, some of this type of compliance cultural change, with some of the crisis planning that we do. I think it's a big opportunity. We've always, we always try to work in coordination with in-house legal teams, as well as outside counsel when we're doing crisis preparedness efforts with clients. We want to include their perspective in it. Often it's something that really is part of their mandate from the board or from the management team. And it's something that fits very nicely kind of under the legal umbrella. And so I think, what we've been doing is bringing that compliance conversation more into that exercise. So when we're talking about coming in and talking about risk, when we're talking about certain scenarios we want to plan for in advance, and certainly as we help clients manage live situations, I think because of the environment that we've been in recently, and we are in right now, and some of the concerns that have arisen, and kind of the airtime that I think compliance is getting more of, that there's a lot more receptivity to having that incorporated in that overall crisis preparedness process.
Absolutely, and I think that there's a lot of talk about recessions coming, and the first step that happens with that is, what is the risk that we face? How are we going to reduce costs and those sort of things? And the challenge there is that they often want to go after the compliance program. And I think that it's really important to understand that you're actually creating much greater risk of loss of profitability when you take those steps that go off. And I appreciate the comment from Kimberly. The scenario planning work that you all do is critically important, and it's a great opportunity to also have some of those risk conversations where you get the leadership of various different parts of the organization, so that the CFO is able to talk to the logistics head, is able to talk to the compliance officer, and the legal department, to talk through how do you deal with those issues in real time, in the same space, virtual or real, and really be challenged by what will happen next, because that's that way you can really get people to think.
Yeah, I think we talk about scenario planning and identifying and assessing risk. And a lot of times we think of these specific scenarios and planning against them, a cyber breach, for example. We could go on with different examples, but it's also about, assessing the process that is happening internally. And so that's such a big piece of what we do in preparedness, is seeing how are issues identified, how are they escalated in the organization, kind of who forms a core group to evaluate them or manage them. And so really kind of breaking that down is where you can break down the silos, establish more connectivity, make the process much more efficient. And you're really able to, mitigate a lot of issues, prevent some, even in a few cases, and manage them so much better when they're unavoidable.
Absolutely. Well, we're putting together, for those of you who are interested in, some checklists that will be available next week, along with some other materials related to this cultural change phenomena, and some descriptions of how we do this scenario planning if people are interested in that. If there aren't any other questions, I'm happy to give people back 2 or so minutes of their day.
Great. I think we're good to wrap up, if that's okay, Max.
Yep.
So a few thank yous for me just before we close. First of all, a big thank you to everyone for joining us for today's session. We'd love to hear what you think. Drop us a note in the chat. Hopefully you'll accept the challenge that Max and Elizabeth have set out in terms of your compliance and engaging, I suppose, with the business in a different type of relationship. We'd love, drop us a note if you don't want to comment now in the chat. Equally, I'd love to say a big thank you to Max and Elizabeth for the time and the thought they put into doing the session with us today. Again, if you'd like to get in contact, we're happy to share details, and also feel free to drop us a note if you'd like a copy of today's slides. And as Max mentioned, the team have some really nice practical checklists as well in store for you over the coming week or so. You'll see on the slide there's lots happening over the coming weeks. If your team hasn't registered, be sure to share the upcoming program of webinars with your team and register with us. We'd love to continue to build out the program with your help. There's lots of topics there, everything from ESG to the metaverse to those sessions that are more focused on personal development. So a final thank you from me, and go and have a great day.